Isaiah Monroe, a 68-year-old black veteran, had just picked up a few things from the supermarket. He was heading home, wearing his old army cap, when a white police officer stopped him, claiming he fit the description. Minutes later, Isaiah was beaten, handcuffed, and charged just for walking while black. At the courthouse, with bruises on his face and dignity intact, he stood alone against a system that had already decided his guilt. But Isaiah's silence wasn't surrender, it was strength waiting to speak. What happens when a man who gave everything for his country is treated like he doesn't belong in it? If this makes you think, leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories. Now let's step into the courtroom. Isaiah Monroe had always walked the same way home. Past the faded mural of war heroes near the old train tracks, through the quiet stretch of Maple Street, where neighbors still waved even if they didn't know your name. At 68, his knees ached more than they used to, and his right hand trembled ever so slightly when the wind changed. But that evening, he carried 2 small bags from the supermarket and wore the same frayed army cap he had worn since Desert Storm. He didn't need much. A carton of milk, a loaf of bread, some medicine for the swelling in his shoulder. But that night, what he carried didn't matter. What he wore didn't matter. What mattered, at least to Officer Cole Riker, was the color of his skin and the fact that Isaiah, a black man, happened to be walking alone. Isaiah didn't see the patrol car until it pulled up fast behind him, tires skidding slightly as it came to a stop. A door swung open, and the voice came hard, sharp, and too loud for the stillness of a residential block. "Stop right there, hands visible." Isaiah turned slowly, startled but calm. He raised both hands, one still clutching the bag. "Evening, officer. Just heading home." Riker stepped out, hand near his belt, eyes narrow and already suspicious. "You match the description of someone reported for disturbing the peace 2 blocks over. Mind telling me where you've been the last 30 minutes? Isaiah blinked. "I just came from the supermarket. I have a receipt in my pocket if you want." "You resisting a question?" "No, sir," Isaiah said gently, lowering the bag to the sidewalk. "I just don't want to be misunderstood." But Riker wasn't interested in clarity. He moved in fast, voice rising. "Turn around, hands on the hood, now." Isaiah hesitated, not because he was disobedient, but because he was confused. Because something about the air had changed, because he had been trained long ago to recognize the moment when respect no longer protected you. "I'm not a threat," he said quietly. "I'm a retired soldier. You can look me up." Riker laughed. It was a short, ugly laugh, and he shoved Isaiah toward the hood of the car. Isaiah stumbled. His cane clattered to the ground. Groceries spilled. "You think that cap makes you special?" Riker spat. "You think a few medals give you a free pass?" Isaiah didn't reply. He couldn't. His head was pushed hard against the car's cold metal, the edge of the hood digging into his ribs. He felt the sharp twist of a wrist behind his back, a pair of cuffs snapping shut, and the sudden flash of heat in his temple where a fist, unprovoked, had struck. Across the street, a curtain shifted. A neighbor, a young woman named Jenna with a toddler on her hip, had seen enough. She didn't yell, didn't open the door. She just held her phone near the glass and hit record. Riker saw her. He turned, face flushed with fury, and shouted, "Move along. This doesn't concern you." But it did, it would. Back at the scene, Isaiah said nothing. He didn't plead, he didn't shout. But his eyes searched the sky as if asking a question the ground would never answer. Riker lifted him roughly and shoved him into the back of the cruiser. "You're under arrest for resisting and assaulting a peace officer." Isaiah tasted blood in his mouth, but didn't bother to spit it out. He sat upright, legs together, back straight, as the door slammed shut beside him. His hands, bound tightly, rested in his lap. There was no noise from him. Not a protest. Not a prayer. Only stillness. Only the sound of the engine starting and the lights of Maple Street reflecting dimly in the backseat window as the cruiser pulled away. Inside the car, Isaiah's grocery bag lay on the floor, torn open. The bread was smashed, the medicine bottle rolled and rattled against his boot. As they turned the corner, Jenna remained at her window, still holding the phone, hand shaking. She knew what she had seen, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel safe calling the police. And still, Isaiah said nothing. When they reached the station, the officer parked with deliberate pause and stepped out without a glance back. A quiet moment passed before Isaiah leaned forward slightly, pressing his forehead against the window. He had survived battlefields with less fear than he felt in that moment. Not for his life, but for what they would try to take from his name, his silence, his dignity, his truth. And as they opened the door and led him out, dragging the cuffs against old bones and an aching spirit, he walked without resistance. Not because he was weak, but because even in chains, Isaiah Monroe knew how to stand taller than the man who had taken him in. The next morning, Isaiah Monroe stepped into the county courthouse with a quiet dignity that refused to break, even beneath the weight of bruises blooming dark across his cheek and a bandaged wrist wrapped tightly in gauze. He wore the same jacket he had the night before, now creased and stained, and the same army cap still clinging to the last pieces of honor it once stood for. The courtroom was mostly empty, but the silence didn't feel peaceful. It was the kind of stillness that made the air heavy, as if justice itself had stepped out of the room long before Isaiah arrived. At the bench sat Judge Walter Greaves, a tall, sharp-eyed white man whose expression hadn't shifted since the court opened. He looked up over his glasses and said flatly, "Another veteran who thinks a medal is a shield." No one in the room reacted. No clerk raised an eyebrow. No officer shifted. It was as though everyone had silently agreed Isaiah Monroe had already been judged before the gavel dropped. Assistant District Attorney Madeline Stone stood and adjusted the collar of her gray blazer. Her voice rang through the courtroom with a rehearsed calm. "Your Honor, the state brings forth charges of resisting arrest, verbal aggression toward an officer, and public disorder. The arresting officer confirms that Mr. Monroe was belligerent and made sudden movements toward him, necessitating force." Isaiah didn't flinch, but inside, something curled. Cole Riker sat at the back of the room, not in uniform this time, but with the same smirk carved across his face. He leaned back in the wooden bench like he owned the place, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Isaiah, with the kind of smugness that comes from knowing the rules don't apply to you. Isaiah took a step forward, slowly, carefully, like a man who knew even gravity might be used against him. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady but worn, "I would like to speak on my own behalf." Judge Greaves didn't even glance up. "We're not here for your speeches, sir." A pause stretched between them. Isaiah swallowed something bitter. Not fear. He had faced that in war zones. It was the sting of being told, once again, that his words didn't matter. He looked toward the courtroom, wondering if anyone at all would question what was unfolding. A bailiff shifted near the door but said nothing. A woman in the gallery glanced up briefly, then turned away, pretending to read the docket in her hands. Isaiah's mind reached back, uninvited, to a dirt road in Kandahar where he had carried 2 wounded men across open fire, dragging them to a helicopter with bullets biting into the sand around his boots. Back then, he believed valor meant something. But now, in this courtroom, his body was older, his scars hidden beneath fabric, and his voice was treated like noise. The ADA continued with her reading, oblivious to the storm brewing just behind Isaiah's calm eyes. Riker chuckled under his breath, not loud, just enough for Isaiah to hear it. The judge tapped his pen once. "Unless there's a plea, we'll proceed as scheduled." Isaiah stood still. His silence wasn't submission, it was restraint. And in that moment, it was clear to anyone paying attention. This wasn't a hearing. This was a display of what happens when truth wears a black face. And the only question that remained was how much longer Isaiah could stand in that silence before the system collapsed under the weight of its own injustice. When Assistant District Attorney Madeline Stone stood up, the courtroom seemed to lean in just slightly. With a calm precision that came from years of pushing paper and people into tight little boxes, she clicked the remote and dimmed the lights. A grainy video flickered to life on the monitor. It showed Isaiah Monroe standing on the sidewalk, one hand still holding a small grocery bag. The footage was shaky and unclear, taken from a distance and edited down to just a few seconds. In that narrow frame, it looked like Isaiah raised his hand toward Officer Riker. Stone's voice sliced the stillness. "This moment here, Your Honor, clearly shows the defendant attempting to strike the officer, an act of aggression." Isaiah stood up slowly. His voice, though tired, was clear. "That's not the full video. There's more. Show the rest." Judge Walter Greaves didn't even lift his eyes. "Sit down, Mr. Monroe. We've seen what we need to see." "But I didn't strike anyone. That clip." The judge raised a hand. "That looked like aggression to me. That is enough." Isaiah clenched his fists at his sides, not in anger, but in a desperate attempt to stay still. It wasn't just the lie that stung. It was the fact that no one in the room seemed interested in whether or not it was the truth. And that silence, cold, collective, practiced, echoed louder than any shout. From the prosecution's table, Riker leaned back and grinned. "Guess no one salutes him now," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Isaiah heard it. He turned toward him, their eyes locked, one man basking in the confidence of power, the other holding on to the last shreds of dignity. "They only see violence," Isaiah said quietly, "when it comes in black skin." A hush fell over the room. No one responded. The bailiff shifted his stance but said nothing. Stone remained expressionless. Greaves scribbled something in his notes as though those words hadn't even reached him. Isaiah's eyes scanned the room, hoping for a sign, any sign that someone had seen through it. Most faces were turned away. The clerk stared at her screen. The stenographer typed mechanically. It was as if the system itself was wearing a blindfold and calling it justice. But near the back of the gallery, a girl no older than 20 sat holding a phone in her lap. Her posture was stiff, her gaze steady. She wasn't scrolling. She wasn't recording now. She was simply watching, eyes wide, mouth pressed into a thin line. And though she didn't speak, something in her face betrayed discomfort, perhaps even disbelief. Isaiah held on to that one thread, because he knew that sometimes the smallest shift could start the largest crack in a wall. He looked down at the scratches on his hands, not from a fight, but from when his body hit the pavement, his wrist twisted in a grip meant to break. He remembered the grocery bags splitting open on the sidewalk, oranges rolling into the gutter. Not one person had stopped. And now here he stood, not to be heard, but to be silenced again. Not because of what he did, but because of who he was. A man too old to run, too proud to bow, and too familiar with the sound of doors closing. His thoughts returned to a different courtroom decades ago. He was in uniform then, standing in the back while a friend of his, also a black vet, was dismissed by a white judge who barely looked up. They had called it justice then, too. History didn't repeat itself. It evolved. Stone shut off the screen. "The state rests its preliminary case, Your Honor." Isaiah opened his mouth again, but Greaves didn't look up. "This is not a space for your speeches, sir." And just like that, the room moved on. But in the quiet that followed, that young woman in the back slowly lifted her phone again. She tapped the screen twice. This time, not to record what the system wanted her to see, but to look deeper. She scrolled through a file saved on her cloud drive, a longer video, one that had never aired, one that told the whole story. And while no one else noticed her at that moment, Isaiah did. Because sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes silence is gathering its strength. And it had just begun to stir. The courtroom had settled into a hush so heavy it felt like weight pressing on every chest. The air was still, but it was not quiet. You could almost hear the thoughts moving, tight and tense, across each bench and behind every stare. Judge Walter Greaves adjusted his robe and leaned slightly forward, his voice low but unmistakably sharp. "Mr. Monroe, before I make my ruling, the court expects an acknowledgement, a statement of contrition. Stand and address the court." Isaiah Monroe stood slowly, each movement deliberate, steady. The bruises along his jaw had begun to deepen in color. His wrist, still wrapped from the night before, looked stiff, but his back remained straight. His hands did not tremble. He looked not at the judge but somewhere beyond him. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps it was something else. His voice, when it came, was neither loud nor defiant. It was even, measured, as if he had spoken this truth before, and would speak it again no matter who listened. "I will not apologize for being thrown to the ground." A few people blinked. Someone near the back shifted in their seat. But Judge Greaves stilled like stone. He waited for more. None came. Isaiah remained upright, silent now, his words hanging in the room like smoke that wouldn't clear. Greaves' expression changed. He tilted his head just slightly, as if he hadn't heard right. "You do understand this is an opportunity to show the court your remorse." Isaiah did not flinch. "I do. And you still refuse." "I do." The pause after that was longer than it should have been. It wasn't the silence of confusion, but of calculation. Then the judge nodded once, like something inside him had been confirmed. "Very well," he said curtly. "This court finds the defendant to be uncooperative, disrespectful, and a potential threat to order. Bail is denied. Mr. Monroe is to be held without release until further proceedings." The words landed not with shock, but with inevitability. At the prosecutor's table, Ada Stone looked down at her papers. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She simply moved her pen to the next line. But Officer Cole Riker, leaning against the gallery railing, let out a short, barking laugh. Guess he's finally learning what war didn't teach him. Isaiah didn't turn. He didn't need to. A bailiff stepped toward him. Another moved to his side. As they approached, Isaiah took one slow breath and stepped forward before being touched. Not in surrender, but in decision. And the room noticed. Because he did not shuffle, he did not slump, he did not glance to the floor as most did when led from a courtroom in cuffs. He walked straight. Every inch of him said that even when the world tried to shrink a man down, he could still take up space. As he passed the gallery, there was no applause, no noise, but there was something else: stillness. A kind of reverent quiet that made even the ones who didn't know him sit up straighter. Near the back, the same young woman from before watched again, her phone resting quietly on her lap, her face unreadable. But this time, when Isaiah passed, their eyes met. It lasted just a moment, but it was enough. Enough to carry something forward. Enough to say, "I saw what they tried to bury." The courtroom door opened. The hallway beyond was dull with institutional light. But before Isaiah stepped through, he paused once, just slightly, not for attention, not for resistance, but as if to let the weight of the moment settle in the bones of those watching. And then he disappeared behind the door, flanked by silence, shadow, and two officers who never saw the full man they had just escorted away. But some did. And that, quietly, was the beginning of everything else. The cell was quiet, but not still. A faint hum echoed from the overhead light, steady as a breath. The cinder-block walls offered nothing but silence, a kind that didn't try to comfort or accuse. Just silence. Isaiah Monroe sat on the bench built into the wall, elbows resting on his knees. The fabric of his shirt was still creased from the courtroom. There was dried sweat at the collar, but he hadn't noticed. What he was holding demanded more from him than discomfort ever could. Pinned just above his heart was a small, worn medal. Bronze. Dull now from age and time, the ribbon frayed at the edges. It hadn't seen the light in years. He had only worn it today because something inside him told him this moment mattered. Not for show. Not for the judge. For something deeper. For memory. He unclasped it slowly, holding it between both hands like a fragile truth, and stared at it for a long time. His eyes didn't water. They didn't harden either. They simply watched, like one soldier watching another. He folded it into a square of cloth, wrapped it tight, and placed it on the bench beside him. Across the bars, a guard named Marcus Bell had been watching from his station. He wasn't speaking, but he wasn't pretending not to see either. A tall black man with years etched into his posture more than his face, Marcus had served once too. A different war, a different time, but some things felt familiar. When Isaiah stood and walked to the bars, Marcus didn't flinch. Isaiah slid something through the space between. A letter. Folded neatly, sealed, no words spoken. Marcus took it, looked down, then looked up again. "You always write letters to the guards?" he asked, voice low, dry. Isaiah gave a small shake of the head, "Only to the ones who know what it means to keep standing when the world wants you on your knees." Marcus blinked. A pause stretched between them. Then he said, softer this time, "There's been a call, from Washington. Someone named Douglas Avery. He says he wants to know everything about you." Isaiah didn't speak right away. He let the words settle, like dust on memory. Finally he nodded once, not in surprise, not in strategy, just in recognition. "Douglas was a captain once," Isaiah said, "back when he still listened more than he gave orders." "You saved his life?" Marcus asked. Isaiah looked at him carefully, then shrugged. "Depends who's telling the story." Marcus half smiled. "Well, he's telling it loud, and the brass are listening." Isaiah returned to his bench and sat back down. Not with relief, not with pride, with something quieter, something heavier. He leaned against the wall and stared ahead, but it was clear he wasn't looking at the walls. He wasn't even in the room anymore. The desert heat, the crackle of static in his ear, the explosion that split the sand, the screams that followed, the silence after, all of it returned, not as noise but as weight, pressing just behind his eyes. But he didn't cry, he didn't shake, he didn't speak. He simply breathed. Because for men like Isaiah, the war never ended in a parade. It stayed in their hands, in the way they folded letters, in the way they stood in court, and in the way they refused to kneel even when every voice around them said to fall. And now, as the hours passed in that quiet cell, Isaiah did not complain. He did not curse. He did not rage at the walls or at the men who locked him there. He folded his hands in his lap, stared into the middle distance, and allowed the silence to be his armor. Because sometimes, the loudest refusal is stillness. And sometimes, the man they try to break is the one who never bends at all. The courtroom was still. Not silent out of respect, but silent like the air before a thunderstorm. The kind of silence that feels like a warning. Judge Greaves adjusted his robe. Ada Stone shuffled her notes, though she hadn't written anything new. Officer Cole Riker leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, lips curled with amusement, as if he already knew how this hearing would end. Isaiah sat at the defense table, his hands once again cuffed. He wasn't dressed in a uniform this time, just a plain shirt and slacks. The bruises on his face had begun to fade, but not the ones inside. He said nothing. He hadn't said much at all since they brought him back in. He just waited, still and composed, the way a man does when he's already faced worse than any courtroom can deliver. Then the door opened. Not the soft swing of someone slipping in late, but the firm, deliberate opening of someone who had nothing to hide. The kind of opening that made heads turn before the footsteps even began. He walked in wearing the full dress uniform of a 4-star general. The medals across his chest gleamed, catching the light with every step. His face was unreadable, stern but calm, and his stride was steady, unwavering. His nameplate read, Avery. But he didn't need it. Everyone knew. Douglas Avery wasn't just any general. He was the highest-ranking black officer in the United States Army. Decorated, respected, a man who had been on the cover of Time and whispered about in defense circles for years. And now he stood at the back of a small-town courtroom, not saying a word. People rose from their seats as if pulled by an invisible string. Even Judge Greaves leaned forward slightly, as if unsure what protocol applied when history itself walked into the room. General Avery didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the prosecutor. He didn't even glance at Riker, though the officer had stopped smirking. He walked straight toward Isaiah. And then, without a word, he stopped just 3 feet away from the defendant's table. Isaiah, still cuffed, slowly looked up. Their eyes met. No one knew what passed between them in that moment. It was not recognition. It was not reunion. It was remembrance. Then General Avery stood tall, pulled his right hand to his brow, and gave Isaiah Monroe a full formal military salute. Not a nod, not a token gesture, a real salute. One held with conviction, with reverence, and with silence so absolute it seemed to mute time itself. The room froze. Stone's lips parted, but no sound came out. Riker blinked once, as if trying to convince himself this was all a mistake. Judge Greaves shifted in his seat, visibly unsettled, his gavel hand tightening without raising. Isaiah did not stand. He didn't need to. He didn't return the salute. He didn't need to. He simply looked into Avery's eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. Something that outranked every badge in that room. Then, at last, General Avery lowered his hand and turned to face the court. "I came here because I heard a man was on trial," he said, voice calm but sharp enough to cut steel. "A man I served with. A man who saved lives on ground so scorched it erased the names of cowards. A man who didn't ask for medals or for thanks. He asked only to be left in peace." He turned his gaze to the judge. "You say this court will decide his character," he continued, each word deliberate. "But I was there when he ran into gunfire to drag out a boy who couldn't walk. I was there when he held the line while others ran. I was there when Isaiah Monroe became more than a soldier. He became a man worth following." Avery's eyes narrowed slightly. "He never needed a courtroom," he said, his voice thickening now, as if holding something back. The battlefield already judged him worthy. A stillness hung in the air so heavy it pressed on the skin. No one moved. No one dared speak. Even Isaiah looked down, not in shame, but as if remembering something he thought he had buried for good. Judge Greaves cleared his throat. "General Avery, I must remind you this is a court of law." Avery cut in, not loud but firm. "Then uphold the law. But don't pretend this is justice, because justice doesn't come wrapped in silence and sealed by fear." Riker tried to lean over to whisper to Ada Stone, but she held up a hand to stop him. Her face had changed. It was subtle, but the confidence had slipped, just a little. Avery walked back toward the gallery, his presence still filling the room even after he had turned away. Before he reached the door, he paused and turned his head one last time. "Men like Isaiah Monroe carried this nation on their backs," he said. "The least we can do is stop pretending we don't see them." Then he walked out. And for a long time after the door closed, no one said a word. Because some truths don't need to be shouted. Some truths wear stars and speak through silence. And sometimes all it takes is a single salute to remind the world who the real hero is. General Avery had not left the courtroom. He stayed. After the salute that stopped the room, he moved slowly to the witness stand, his uniform rustling like a quiet wave across the silence. He took the oath with a calm, practiced voice, and when the judge motioned for him to speak, he did not begin with a title or an introduction. He just looked at Isaiah and said, "The man you want to cage is the reason I stand here free." No one in the room spoke. No one dared. Isaiah did not react outwardly, but his shoulders, which had carried the weight of silence for days, eased just slightly. Assistant District Attorney Stone stood up, her voice clipped and tight. "Your Honor, that testimony is not admissible. He wasn't present during the incident in question." Avery turned to her, his eyes calm but firm. "I wasn't present in that courtroom, but I was in Kandahar. I remember what it looked like when the convoy was ambushed. I remember the smell of burning metal, the sound of rounds hitting steel, and the split-second decisions that decided whether we'd live or be remembered only by name." He paused and glanced at the jury, though most of their eyes were already locked on him. "I was a captain then, and I panicked, froze behind the wheel of that transport like a man waiting to die. Isaiah didn't. He ran toward the gunfire, not away. He pulled me and two others out before the second explosion. He didn't check our ranks, didn't ask who we voted for, didn't care if we'd ever salute him. He just moved, because that's what men of character do." Stone interjected again. "With all due respect, General, that still doesn't relate to this case." Avery let the interruption fall away like it didn't belong to the room. "Then let history decide who they remember." Judge Greaves narrowed his eyes. He didn't respond, didn't overrule or affirm. He simply looked down at his papers, as if unsure whether to confront the weight of what had just been spoken. In the back row, Cole Riker shifted in his seat. The confidence on his face cracked slightly, not from anything said directly to him, but from the way the air in the room had changed. It was no longer his courtroom. The silence that once belonged to him now hovered around Isaiah. Isaiah sat still, his hands cuffed in front of him, but his eyes that had looked tired and heavy now held a quiet, distant light. Not pride, not hope, just the presence of something that had been long buried finally surfacing. The kind of dignity that doesn't ask to be noticed, but once it is, cannot be ignored. Riker looked around, and for the first time the faces in the room weren't nodding when he spoke. They weren't smirking when he laughed. They weren't afraid of Isaiah anymore. They were beginning to see him. The man he tried to humiliate now stood taller, without standing at all. Avery turned one last time to the judge. "You may decide what he is on paper, but I already know who he is, and I'm not alone." Then he stepped away, leaving behind no argument, no need to convince, only a memory too honorable to be dismissed. Isaiah didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Because sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't spoken, it's remembered. No one expected the man who cleaned the courtroom floor to be the one holding the truth. But Marcus Bell, quiet and steady as always, walked toward the front with a flash drive in his hand. His uniform was simple, his presence nearly invisible to those who never bothered to look. But today, he moved with quiet purpose. "Your Honor," he said, "this is footage recorded by a resident across the street. They sent it to me because they knew who I used to be, because they knew what I still stand for." Judge Greaves looked over his glasses with wary skepticism. The courtroom shifted. Avery sat upright. Isaiah did not move, but his eyes locked onto Marcus like they had long expected this moment, like they had trusted it might still come. The screen flickered to life. There was no dramatic music, no narration, just raw sound and grainy footage. And in that footage, there stood Isaiah, right outside the courthouse steps, motionless, calm. His hands were at his sides. The footage showed clearly that it was Riker who had shouted first. Riker who had stepped into Isaiah's space. Riker who had shoved him. Then, with a sudden strike that stunned even the silence, Riker raised his baton and brought it down hard across Isaiah's shoulder. The courtroom gasped. The strike echoed more in memory than sound. And then came the moment that shattered the version they had tried to sell. Isaiah did not raise his hand. He did not retaliate. He stood. Still. Unmoving. His eyes met Riker's in the frame, and he said nothing. The tape went on longer than the doctored clip from earlier, longer than the accusations, and every second peeled back the lie until it lay naked in front of the entire courtroom. "That's enough," Judge Greaves muttered, waving a hand. But Avery's voice came firm and low, like steel under velvet. "No. Play it again, and let the silence shame them." The judge hesitated, but something in the room had already shifted. This was no longer a room under his control. The faces in the gallery had changed. They were no longer watching Isaiah. They were watching the system. And it was unraveling. The footage rolled again. This time, no one blinked. Riker sat stiffly, trying not to shift, his jaw clenched tight, his power drained not all at once, but like a slow leak exposed in daylight. Ada Stone sat motionless. Her pen hovered midair, forgotten. When the video ended for the second time, there was no applause, no outburst. Only that silence, that brutal cutting silence that says more than any protest ever could. Isaiah, still in chains, stood up slowly. He looked at Greaves, then at the jury, then at no one in particular. His voice did not rise, it did not crack. Now he said, "You have heard me." Without me needing to raise my voice, no one moved. For a moment, the courtroom felt smaller, like the walls had closed in on the ones who had chosen to look the other way, like the lie had become heavier than the truth they tried to bury. Marcus Bell took his seat again, quietly, without a word. And Isaiah sat too, but not like a man accused. He sat like a man who had carried the weight long enough, and now, finally, the weight was being seen. It was the sound of nothing that filled the room. And in that nothing, everything had changed. There is a silence that feels like waiting, and then there is a silence that feels like judgment. The kind that settles into the floorboards and into the breath of every person in the room. That is what followed the video. That is what filled the courtroom as Isaiah sat unbothered, uncowed, unbroken. But Riker, he could not stand it. He stood up with the kind of motion that said he didn't plan it. His face twisted, the words leaving his mouth before anyone could stop them. "He's just another loudmouth with a pity story." The words echoed, not with conviction, but with desperation. Like a man shouting at a mirror he could no longer recognize. Isaiah turned his head, not quickly, not sharply, just enough to see him. And then he stood, slowly, without the aid of power, without the illusion of office or badge or bench. And with his voice quiet and steady, he answered, "You feared me not because of what I did. You feared me because I walked tall." The air shifted again, but this time it broke. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and two figures in dark suits stepped inside. Their movements were deliberate, unhurried. There was no rush in their pace, because justice, when it walks in late, walks in with confidence. They walked straight toward the prosecution table. One of them, a tall black woman with a badge clipped at her waist, addressed the court clearly. "By the authority of the Department of Justice, Officer Cole Riker is hereby placed under federal arrest for falsifying evidence, obstruction of justice, and assault under color of law." Riker's chair scraped backward. His mouth opened, but no words followed. The room didn't gasp. It didn't cheer. It simply watched. As if everyone had already known this day was coming, they just hadn't known when. The agents moved forward. Riker tried to speak, tried to defend, but what came out was not a defense. It was noise. It was the sound of power crumbling. He looked to Judge Greaves. The judge did not meet his eyes. Instead, the second agent turned to the bench. "And you, Your Honor, are hereby suspended pending a full ethics investigation. Your robe will no longer cover your bias." Greaves sat very still. His hands rested on the bench like they were holding something together. But there was nothing left to hold. Not authority, not silence, not the loyalty of the room. There was no gavel slam, no sharp retort, just the sound of the world changing beneath him. And then in the center of it all came the moment that would be remembered long after the transcripts were filed. The agents approached Isaiah. For a second, the crowd tensed, but they did not touch him. Instead, they looked to the bailiff, and the bailiff, his hands slightly trembling, stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. The sound of metal opening was barely audible, but it rang louder than any verdict. Isaiah brought his wrists together slowly, rubbing the faint impressions the cuffs had left. And then he turned, not to the judge, not to the prosecution, but to the gallery. To the people who had come to watch. Some who had doubted, some who had waited, and they stood. All of them. Without applause, without shouting, they just rose. A courtroom full of people, standing not because they were told to, but because something inside them had risen first. Isaiah nodded once, a small gesture that felt larger than any speech. His silence, which had once been mistaken for defeat, now held the weight of truth. He did not gloat. He did not stare down his accusers. He simply walked back to his seat and remained there, tall in presence, even when seated. Outside, the winds were beginning to rise. Reporters waited. Cameras blinked red. But inside, the room stayed still for just a little longer, letting the echo of justice take its full shape. And those who had once looked at Isaiah as a man to be managed now saw him for what he'd always been, a man who never asked for permission to exist, only to be seen for who he truly was. A few days later, the courtroom was just a building again. The voices that once echoed inside had long since faded, and the headlines had begun to move on. But Isaiah, as always, walked quietly through a world that still remembered. That morning, he wore no uniform, no medals, just a plain shirt, loose at the collar, and the same worn shoes that had carried him through every chapter of his life. His steps were slow, not because of pain, but because he had never been the kind of man to rush through moments that mattered. He passed through the old Veterans Park on the edge of the city. The breeze was light, flags shifted gently in the wind, and carved into the stone nearby were names, dozens of them, men and women who never came home. Isaiah paused for a moment, letting the silence of that place settle around him like a familiar weight. From a bench nearby, Marcus Bell stood and approached. The younger man, still in civilian clothes himself, held something in his hand. Not a medal, not a plaque, just a small, hand-carved wooden badge no bigger than a palm. Marcus didn't say much. He just held it out and said quietly, "For the stand you took." Isaiah turned the piece of wood over in his fingers. On one side it was simple, raw, unpolished. On the back, carved with care, were 6 words that seemed to settle deeper than any courtroom declaration ever could. "For the stand you took." Isaiah didn't thank him with words. He just nodded once, slowly, and tucked it into his pocket like it had always belonged there. As he continued his walk down the gravel path, people began to notice. Not many, just a few at first. A young father paused mid-conversation with his daughter. An older woman sitting beneath a tree stood slowly, watching him approach. No one clapped, no one shouted. They simply stepped aside, cleared the path, as if the very ground knew who walked upon it. Isaiah never broke his stride. His eyes stayed forward. But one could see in the corners of his expression that he noticed, that it moved him more than he would ever say out loud. And then, from the far edge of the park, just beyond the row of oak trees, stood a tall man in full uniform. Douglas Avery. No stars pinned to his collar today. No salute raised high, just a single gesture. He placed his hand gently over his heart and bowed his head. It was not a salute of rank. It was not a gesture for ceremony. It was the kind of quiet reverence that one warrior gives another when words no longer suffice. Isaiah met his eyes for just a moment, then gave a small nod in return. He kept walking, not toward glory, not toward cameras, just forward, as he always had. And though the world around him continued in its usual hum of noise and motion, there was a stillness in that park that seemed to linger long after he had passed. Someone whispered softly nearby, maybe to themselves or maybe to the wind. They arrested a man for walking home, but the world stood still for the way he walked out. And that was how it ended. Not with a gavel, not with a speech, but with silence. The kind that does not forget. the kind that stays with you, the kind that salutes without lifting a hand. And if this story moved you, even just a little, take a moment to reflect on what it means to stand tall when the world tries to bend you. Isaiah didn't ask for a spotlight. He didn't raise his voice. But through dignity, resilience, and quiet strength, he reminded us all of what real courage looks like. This was never just about a courtroom. It was about justice, about the power of one man's walk through fire and the silence that followed when truth stood undefeated. If this story spoke to you, please tap that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories so you never miss the next journey we tell. Your support helps us keep bringing these powerful moments to life. It gives our team the strength to keep telling the stories that matter, the ones too often left untold. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we believe some salutes don't come with applause. They come with memory. Thank you for walking with us.